I'm married now, but when this happened, I was single. I had bought my house about a year before this incident, and I was living there by myself. My property spanned several acres with only a few neighbors who were far away. The house was old and needed work. Not too far away, about 30 meters, there was a detached garage. I used it to store my car and a few tools. I do woodworking and carpentry, so it was also my shop. Surrounding my property were fields and trees. The main road was almost a mile down my driveway, and the nearest town was at least a 45-minute drive. That would be in broad daylight and in good weather. The dirt roads around there could get pretty rough in the winter or in the rain. On this particular night, the rain was pouring. I was sitting in my living room with a mug of tea, reading some web pages. The TV was on in the background. My chair faced the TV, but there was also a window off to the side. Through it, I had a view of my detached garage. It was dark and rainy, but there was a light on the garage, and I could see it shining through my window. It was then that I caught a glimpse of what looked like a shadow past the garage. My first thought was that it looked like a person, but that seemed unlikely. It was a remote area, so I thought it was probably a deer. They're common in my area. I decided to check it out anyway, just to dispel my suspicions. Grabbing my hunting rifle for safety, I made my way to the garage, my boots splashing in the puddle as I made my way there. I opened the door and turned on the lights. It was a bare bulb hanging in the middle of the space, but it was bright. Upon inspecting the garage, I found nothing. It was just as I left it. Thinking it was nothing, I turned around and headed back to my house. When I got there, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. The door was ajar, and I was almost sure that I had shut it before. I pushed it open and stepped inside. That was when I was sure that there was something wrong. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading further inside. I knew for a fact that I didn't make them, and they weren't there minutes earlier. I gripped my gun tighter, preparing myself for anything. As I ventured in, I heard a noise from the adjoining room. It sounded like footsteps and maybe a cupboard opening. I knew that calling the police would do little good. It would take at least an hour to get there on a night like this. I couldn't just let some stranger ransack my house, but I was also scared and didn't know if he was armed. I moved quietly, trying to gauge the situation. The footsteps grew louder, and as I turned the corner, there he was, a tall, burly man holding one of the knives I kept in the kitchen. Our eyes locked for a moment. He was very intimidating, but he looked as scared as me. His hands were shaking, and he was dripping with rainwater. I thought he might have even been crying, but it was hard to tell with the rain. Either way, he seemed unstable, and that made me even more scared. He took a step towards me, but then his eyes darted to the gun that I was holding. I looked down at my rifle, and then back up to the man. I began to raise my weapon in defense, but before I could, he halted. Without uttering a word, he quickly turned on his heels and sprinted towards the back door. I heard the door swing open, but it didn't close. I waited about 10 seconds before moving, but eventually I went to the back door. It was wide open, and rainwater was blowing onto the kitchen floor. I peeked out into the night, but it was way too dark to see. He could have been anywhere, and I wouldn't know. That may have been the creepiest part of all. After locking all the doors and windows, I called the police. Like I said, they were far away. To make matters worse, they refused to come that night because the roads were too dangerous. Since it was not considered an emergency, I would have to wait until the next morning. I didn't sleep a wink that night. When dawn broke, officers arrived and heard me out. They inspected the wet footprints in the area around my house. But with the rain washing away most evidence outside, they had little to go on. They couldn't even find tire tracks for his vehicle, if there was one. We still had no idea where he went that night. They advised me to install security cameras, a suggestion that I took to heart. I installed not only security cameras, but also a full alarm system. It's been almost 10 years since this happened. Like I said, I'm married now, and we have our first child on the way. Despite this incident, I think it's a great place to raise a family. I often wondered about the intruder, though. What was he looking for? Why my house? I didn't have much to steal, and he would have had to know that I was home, since all my lights were on. Whatever his reasons, I hope our paths never cross again. A few years ago, I worked for a cleaning company. We worked mostly after hours because our work was for restaurants and office buildings, and they needed us to be there when the place was empty. I really messed up my sleep, but being a naturally introverted guy, I didn't mind it. I was able to avoid all the big crowds of people that you need to deal with during the day shifts. One rainy night, I was cleaning an office building. It wasn't downtown or anything, more like an industrial area off the highway. There were several large glass buildings around there, and some warehouses if you went further down. I imagined the place would be really busy during the day with all the workers, but whenever I was there, it was quite deserted. The building had a security guard on duty for the nights. His name was Pete, and he was a pretty good guy. We talked for a few minutes before getting started. I was paired with Mike, a guy who'd been with the company for a couple months. He was tall, with a rugged appearance, but he was also the kindest guy you'd ever meet. I was a little more experienced than him, so although I was technically in charge, we were really equals. We split up and started working, both listening to music or a podcast. As we cleaned the 5th floor, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows. I paused for a moment and looked outside. The window was overlooking the parking lot. It was well lit, with a lamppost for every 5 or 6 parking spaces. Our work van was out there, but I couldn't see it because we parked right next to the building. I did, however, see a man walking briskly through the pouring rain. He wasn't dressed for the weather. As far as I could tell, he was just wearing a black hoodie and jeans. I walked over to Mike, who was on the same floor at the time. We went to the window, and I pointed to the man. "Who'd be out there in this rain?" I asked him. Mike squinted, trying to make out the man's face. "Can't tell, but it doesn't look like he's enjoying the weather," Mike said. We chuckled and then went back to work. Later in the night, I was down at the end of one of the corridors on the 2nd floor. Mike was on the ground floor finishing up. It was 2 a.m. by then. Out of nowhere, I heard Mike call out to me, and it sounded urgent. I dropped my stuff and sprinted towards the sound, almost face-planting on the freshly mopped floor. I found Mike by the back entrance, near where our van was parked, and he looked horrified. He went on to blurt out what happened. He said he was loading some gear into the back of our van when a strange man approached him from the side. Mike asked if he was all right, but the guy just stood there silently for 30 seconds. As soon as Mike was about to turn away, he pulled a gun on him and demanded the keys to his van and Mike's phone. Within seconds, the man was gone. That's when Mike called for me. I pulled out my phone and dialed the security guard. Pete immediately picked up the phone and dialed the police. Meanwhile, Mike and I approached the glass entrance, scanning the parking lot. It was empty save for the puddles of rainwater. Our van was gone. Minutes later, sirens drew closer and 2 police cars pulled up to the building. After explaining the situation, the officers talked to Pete for a few minutes. After they were gone, Pete walked up to us. "You know," he began thoughtfully, "I've seen that guy before. At least it sounds similar." Mike and I exchanged a glance. "You have?" I asked. Pete nodded, scratching his thinning hair. "A few days back, late at night, I saw a man wandering the lot, looking lost. I went out to ask him to move along, but when I got there, he was gone. We don't know for sure if it was the same guy, but it sounds like it might have been." The police patrolled the area looking for our van. The cleaning company's insurance would cover it, but that did little to calm our nerves. The next day, the cops found the van in an alley downtown. It was absolutely trashed, and our gear was missing. Our company ramped up security, and I decided to stay on. I'd been there for a long time at that point. Mike, however, decided to leave the job. The experience had been too traumatic for him. I can only imagine going through something like that after only a few months on the job. It was late summer of last year, and I was driving home from my parents' house. My parents live in a different state than me, and it's almost a full day's drive each way. I had been on the road for 4 or 5 hours, and it was raining pretty hard for most of that time. My parents had begged me to stay for the night because the weather forecast predicted heavy rain. I had to work the next day though, so I was adamant about returning home. With each mile, I regretted my decision more and more. I hate driving in the rain, especially because my car isn't the best. The wipers struggled to keep up, and visibility wasn't great. I had been on the road for hours, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The comforting hum of my radio was drowned out by the roar of the rain on the car roof. My headlights barely penetrated the curtain of water in front of me. I was following my GPS for a section of some of the back roads, and I came upon a sign warning that the road ahead was closed. I pulled over, checking my GPS for alternate routes. Every suggested detour added a lot of time to my drive. My eyelids were heavy, and the thought of going any further in this weather was daunting. It was then that I decided to stay the night somewhere. I searched for the nearest motel, and there was one that was not too far away. It was around 9 p.m. by then. The place wasn't fancy by any stretch, just a one-story elongated structure with a few parked cars. It was all I needed, and it looked cheap, so that was perfect. I parked outside the main office and ran in, shielding my head from the rain with my jacket. Behind the counter, a woman with graying hair looked up, offering a sympathetic smile. "Looks like you've had a rough drive," she commented. "You have no idea," I replied, shaking the water off. "You got any rooms available?" "We have a few left," she said, handing me a key. "Room 17, just down the way." I took the key and headed to my room, which was the second one from the end on the farthest side from the office. I went and dropped off my stuff, and then moved my car over afterwards. The room was modest, with a bed, TV, and bathroom, but it was dry and warm. After a quick shower, I changed into some more comfortable clothes and settled into the bed, hoping to get to sleep early. I had just started drifting off when a car pulled up right in front of my door. The bright lights flooded the room through the window. I was a little annoyed and sat up. The car parked right in front of my room. I then heard the door open, and the shadow of a man moved in front of my window. Seconds later, I heard a loud banging at my door. I approached cautiously. "Can I help you?" I called out. A gruff voice replied,
"I'm the manager. I need to check something in the room. It's kind of an emergency."
Why would the manager need to inspect the room at this hour? My instincts screamed that something was off. "Give me a second," I replied. I didn't really believe him, so I decided to call the front desk to check. I dialed the reception. The same woman who had checked me in answered. "Hi, there's a man at my door claiming to be the manager, and he wants to inspect the room. Is this normal?" I asked her. She paused for a moment, and then her voice grew tense. "Sir, we don't have any male staff working tonight. Do not open the door. Stay where you are. I'm calling the police." My heart raced even faster. I moved away from the door, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There wasn't much, so I grabbed my keys and gripped them between my knuckles. All the while, the knocking persisted. Then the man yelled for me to open the door. "Hold on, I'm just getting changed," I shouted back, not wanting him to know that I called. He must have known somehow, because seconds later the knocking stopped. Peering out the window, I saw him get back into his car and drive off. About 20 minutes after that, the police arrived. I did what I could to provide a description of the man in the vehicle, though I hadn't gotten a good look at either. The woman at the front desk came out as well. The rain had mostly stopped by then, but we were still huddled under the small space of shelter next to the building. The woman admitted that this was not the first time it had happened. She told the cops that the man was a local guy who had tried this before. For whatever reason, she didn't call the cops until this night. I guess she gave him a warning before, silly as that sounds. With that, the cops were able to pick up the man that night. I didn't hear much about it after that. I went home the next day and didn't worry about it again. If I had to guess, it was probably an opportunistic robbery attempt. He must have been hoping that I was the most gullible person in the world, because that's what you would have to be to fall for a scam like that. The rain was unrelenting that night, beating against my windshield with such force that even my wipers on the highest setting struggled to keep up. I kept both hands tightly wrapped around the steering wheel as my tires navigated the wet roads. Each drop of rain was splattering heavily. It had been a late evening at work, and all I could think about was crashing into my warm bed at home. I'm a server and bartender at a really busy spot downtown. The constant crowds and loud music always tires me out by the end of the night. I lived a fair distance out of the city. Rent is way too expensive in the downtown area, so I was living with my parents at the time. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:34 a.m. Believe it or not, that's actually an earlier night for me. The drive was mundane, and the roads were deserted. I was in a somewhat residential area, with large apartment buildings and older houses. There were also some businesses dotted between. I was near a McDonald's where I would sometimes grab a coffee for the drive. I didn't bother that night though, because I thought I was okay. That's when I saw him. Emerging from the curtain of rain was a figure, desperately waving his arms, attempting to flag me down. I was startled and braked hard, because the guy was in the middle of the road. Otherwise I wouldn't have stopped. The car skidded slightly on the wet surface. Drawing to a stop, I took a deep breath and rolled my window down just enough to hear the man over the rain. He was drenched to the bone. His eyes were wild with panic, and he was out of breath.
Please help me. They're after me,
he exclaimed desperately. I squinted at him. Who's after you? I asked, my voice dripping with skepticism. He didn't answer, just kept ranting and begging to come into my car. That was when I finally got a good look at the man. He was young, probably 20 years old, but his eyes were deeply sunken in, and his teeth were dark yellow. He wore a black winter hat, even though it was summer, and it was soaking wet. Despite the terror evident in his eyes, I was unconvinced. After all, in this day and age, it wasn't uncommon to hear stories of scams. I drove this road all the time, and I had never seen or heard anything like this before. I thought it was a pretty safe neighborhood. Also, it was not like we were in the middle of nowhere. There were other places he could go, several fast food restaurants that were open and minutes away. I waited for a few seconds before answering, but I said, "Sorry, but I can't help you," and then I rolled up my window. With that, I drove off, leaving the man standing alone amidst the downpour. Within seconds, I heard two loud bangs. My back window and one of my side windows smashed. Tiny shards of glass sprayed into the car. The surprise and adrenaline sent me into autopilot. I floored the accelerator and sped away. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. In the rearview mirror, the man's figure grew smaller. The shattered window let in the cold rain, drenching my car in seconds. The rest of the drive was a blur. I pulled over and called the cops when I was home in my driveway. I know I should have called sooner, but I just needed to get away. When I talked to the officer, the shooting was already reported, and officers were on the scene with the suspect in custody. Apparently there was security footage from one of the buildings nearby. Even still, I was asked to come in and give an interview. After I told them my story, I was allowed to go home. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I sat for a moment, trying to calm down. My car's interior was soaked. The seat, dashboard, and floor were littered with glass shards. It took hours for the adrenaline to wear off, and when it did, the weight of what could have happened crashed down on me. There's no reasonable explanation for what that guy did to me. No reason other than pure anger and hatred. If all he wanted was to rob me, then what good would it do to shoot through my car? If I'd let him in, then there's no doubt in my mind that I'd be dead.